Thank you so much for being here with us, Michael. Is there anything that you would like to add or want folks to know as an introduction to you?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah,
Mm.
just had, um, as you'll see from our conversation, is I've had a somewhat unusual life, and there's a lot of aspects to it.
So take us back to the beginning, back to your childhood. How would you describe your childhood or the culture of your family as you were growing up?
Oh boy. Okay, so like when I think of my childhood, even though there was four of us, mother, father, older brother, and me, it was four really completely different worlds. My father was both my parents didn't graduate high school. Like I didn't come from wealth. I didn't come from, I mean, they knew how to read and write and read books and stuff like that. They weren't stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Just I didn't grow up in a well-to-do family. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, and lived most of my childhood in the suburbs of Newark. Um, and by accident, and I say this playfully and I mean it, my dad got a raise because I grew up in the 60s. He was making 12,000 a year, which was completely, that was decent. That wasn't awful money back then.
Mm-hmm.
And because of a weird thing that happened in his company, he left on a Friday earning 12,000 a year, and he returned on a Monday with a job he didn't apply for. They just gave him 40,000 a year. So we
Oh,
went
wow.
from living with nothing to living fairly well, like literally in a sneeze.
Wow. Mm.
I mean, and you talk about privilege. I mean, not every family goes from 12 to $40,000 a year when 40,000 then is the equivalent probably of about 250,000 now.
Right. Mm.
So my dad, what I got from my dad, and I still have today, is we both could talk a lot, and we both are interesting people, very charismatic, and he was dynamic. I guess I am as well, as was my brother. And in the 27 years that my parents were married, he literally cheated on her with dozens of women, most of
Um,
them being half his age.
and this is
And
something that, were you aware of that as a child or something that you've become aware of as an adult?
well, I mean, I got divorced when I was 10,
Oh, okay. Okay.
and I happened to be home from school sick. They forgot I was there during the argument that my mother had found out that he was cheating and the divorce started. So I knew before they told me. They forgot that I was home, which was tragic in its own right. Do you know what I
Mm.
mean? Just one, that they forgot their kid was sick, home from school sick, and they didn't get to tell me about what was happening the way you would typically tell a kid what was happening.
Right.
So that was my dad. My mom, Italian woman, grew up in a family with a ton of violence, and her dad died before my grandfather died before I was born, and he used to get drunk every day and beat up my grandmother and my mom and her brother and her mother, I mean her sister.
Mm.
So she grew up with a ton of violence, and she was a total survivor. And she's sort of the the classic story of the mother who puts up with all of the stuff happening around her and just shows up and does what has to be done, and just the tight jaw of,
Mm.
I'm going to find a way to do this. You
Yeah.
people are not going to ruin me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which probably comes in handy when you were now divorced and taking care of two kids.
Yeah, and I
Mm-hmm.
mean, even
Mm.
even before they were divorced, I didn't know this till after my dad died, that my mother told me that she had asked him for years, she wanted to get pregnant,
Mm.
and he didn't want to have kids. And finally one day he said, I'm sick of you complaining. I'll agree that you can have children, but I'm telling you now, I'm never going to be their father. I'm not interested in being a parent. And my mom made the joke later on in life and said, it's the only promise he ever kept. But it's true. My
Mm.
father never was my father. He lived with me for a while, and then I lived with him for a while, but he was never a father to me or my brother.
Mm.
And then the other part of my family was my older brother. All three of them are dead. So
Okay.
I'm very comfortable sharing these stories because they're not here, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
So my older brother was very, very violent, and he actually grew up to be a strong arm in the mob.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which I
So
know
he
you
was
talk a
even
lot about in your book
right.
and in your work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So that's my brother. So my part in all of this is I was born a semi-genius, and where it came out in my life in in my youth, Sierra, is the fact that I was smart enough to know always what was happening around me and knew what I had to be to survive in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Like, I
and
mean, I was also good in school, but that was just, I was a good liar, you know?
mm, learning what it took to survive in your family, what it took to survive in
Right.
your circumstances.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, and I know that some of what we have planned to talk about and what you pretty openly talk about is the culture of violence within your family and the culture of abuse within your family. Can you share as much or as little as you're comfortable with what that looked like for you?
Yeah. So, along with my brother being physically violent,
Mm-hmm.
like he beat up teachers, he beat up security guards, he beat up guidance counselors, he was arrested a ton of times beyond his strong arm form of violence. Between when I was like 8, 9, and 10, um, he sexually molested me several times.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew something about what he was doing was wrong, but I didn't know what was wrong about it. It just felt wrong. But this was a different culture. We're talking about the late 60s in the United States, and
Mm-hmm.
this wasn't a thing then. I mean, it was a thing that happened. It just wasn't a thing that got talked about, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I knew there was something that was wrong. Um, my father crossed some physical boundaries with me as well. I wouldn't define it as molestation, but he just did some things that I have some little vivid snapshots in my memory of with my dad of just you just wouldn't do this with a kid.
Right. As you were saying, culturally, this is not something your family was really talking about. Did you share with anyone, family or otherwise, about what happened to you?
None of it. I mean, I shared the violence of my brother, but not any of the sexual abuse, and there was none of those kind of things, none of the emotional abuse from either of them, just the punching and the hitting and all of those kind of things, but not any of the sexual stuff. Um, I I know we're going to loop to this, but it's active now. I was actually in my 30s. I was a social worker, working with a program that worked at kids and families that Child Protective Services had worked with for years unsuccessfully. And I became director of that program. And one day I got handed this new case we were going to be working with. And I can remember it so clearly, Sierra. I opened the file and it talked about what happened to me. And I had my first flashback. I didn't remember any of this, Sierra. Like I went through all of my teens and 20s without me having any knowledge about any of this. My brain just wiped it out of my memory. And, I got sober in 1989, September 11th, 1989, and rehab people and therapists. Everybody said, you really seem like you come from sexual abuse. And I didn't feel like I was lying to them when I said no. It felt really simple and clean. So I had that flashback. I was 33, 34, something like that. And it rocked me. It rocked me because I was so unprepared for it. Like if somebody had told me I had murdered somebody during my drug and alcohol years, I don't think that would have shaken me to the same degree because I did so many awful things that would have just been part of the awful things. I was so unprepared for this. And it shook me, rocked me at my core. My partner at the time was also a social worker. I was deeply still involved in AA at that point, was still working with the therapist that I had met when I was in a locked mental hospital, and Lorraine was great and she was spectacular. And actually, when I shared it with her, she said, good, now we can do our work. I was waiting for this. Because she had brought it up to me several times. I was the classic case without knowing I was the classic case. It was a slew. That next few weeks, I must have had 5, 7, maybe 8 different flashbacks of different events. And then over the next year, there was other variations that I had flashbacks of as well. And Lorraine was spectacular, and we didn't know then what we know about CPPSD. We didn't know about that then. We didn't know how it stays in the body. We didn't know all of the somatic stuff that we know today. We didn't know any of that. But Lorraine was fantastic. My partner was fantastic. My sponsor was fantastic. My friends were fantastic. Nobody ran for cover. I did. I did.
What do you think would have happened if you did tell anyone about the sexual abuse?
If anybody let David know, my brother, if anybody let David know that I had told them, it's very possible, even though he was still only in his mid-teens, it's very possible I would have been murdered. I share this story a lot because it gives context on how unusual it was. When my brother was 17, him and two of his best friends, they were both on the same football team at our high school, had gotten into a beef with one of the local towns, and there was going to be this big brawl, the three of them with these 6 or 8 guys. And my brother was at dinner with his girlfriend, and he drove separately from the other 2 guys, and they were to meet there. But this being when it was, they got a flat tire, and he had no way of knowing that. So he showed up at this field on a Friday night with these 6 guys that were all bigger than him, and he put all 6 of them in the hospital, and their parents pressed charges. And in the courtroom, this is literally what the judge said. Do you all really expect me to believe that this 170-pound guy did this to all of these guys that are bigger than them, and they're all in the hospital? I'm sorry, I don't believe you. Get out of my court. And that happened a lot, that kind of thing. Right. So these boys that he beat up, they're all shown up in slings and scars and broken noses and lost teeth and all that. And it was just one kid. It was just him. So I knew what he was capable of everywhere. He was moved through 6 different schools because, again, they didn't have programs for this stuff back then. So they just kept moving them to different schools. Both my parents did, but also the school system. Oh, we'll try this school. Oh, we'll try. Everybody knew. Everybody knew. Yeah. In fact, it was so prevalent and he was so known that, as weird as this sounds, like if a kid older than me would make fun of me somewhere down the street or something, I would just tell them who my brother was and they'd just run away. And that had its own weird kind of power. Right. So we have that going on, 8 to 10. Parents get divorced. Dad moves out. Dad has a heart attack and comes back to life. The following year, my mother has breast cancer and has both of her breasts removed. And the following year, the courts moved me from my mother to my father. So I went through 3 really hellish years. I went from a kid, and I'm not exaggerating about any of this, I went from a kid that was in the top 1 percentile in the country on fill-in-the-dot tests of intelligence to failing in school in a matter of like 2.5 years. Everything crumbled. And I was different because what I saw, because you just said this twice, there was no consequences for him. I figured out that I could do what I wanted and there would be no consequences. Everybody's going to pay because I got screwed over.
How do you think being a boy and ideas about masculinity factored into your experiences?
If I understand what you're asking me, is what I saw, what I experienced, and what my father and brother told me about being a boy and a man and what girls and women are like and how to get away with it. I'm one of the few boys that was explicitly trained in how to manipulate and exploit girls and women. They literally sat me down and told me how to do it. And I wasn't that kid, and I resisted and I resisted. Like I heard and I saw, it got them what I wanted was to be popular, and the cute girls and the women, I wanted all of that, but it wasn't who I am. But a few years into the mess in my family, the parts of me that were bigger than, I mean, we're talking about patriarchy and I know you're not using these words, but we're also talking about white supremacy here because they're so intertwined. It's the same thing. I'm light skinned, I'm man, I know how to talk, I will get away with everything.
You've shared that as you grew to be a man, you wanted to be a protector of women, but ended up being what girls and women needed protection from. What do you mean by this?
Sierra, when I started changing, this is what teachers and guidance counselors and principals said to me. At least you're not David. I would get sent to the office for doing awful things in the classroom, and that's what they would say to me is they'd smile and say, at least you're not David. I had a judge tell me that in a courtroom, right? So what started to change for me, because I think this is kind of what you were getting at, and maybe I'm missing it here. I always had a ton of friends. I never had a lacking of boyfriends, girlfriends, like groups of friends. I had multiple groups of friends because I played sports. I also was really smart. I also was a wise ass. So I had several groups of friends. Do you know what I mean? I never was lacking friends. But what started to change with me was how I interacted with the girls my age. It started with really small things, not small to the different her involved, the different girls involved, but it started with small things like, if they were raising their hand and the teacher wasn't looking, I would grab their breast in the classroom because I knew they wouldn't tell anybody because they'd have to, I mean, this was even more so then, they'd have to explain why they let a boy do this to them, not why was he a jerk. It started with that, and then it became convincing some of the girls who were a few years younger than me to let me do things that they didn't want to do because I was older and I was unstable and really unpredictable. And it was easier for them to say yes than continue to say no. And that was one of the things my father and brother and my uncle John taught me is if you just keep pushing, eventually they're just going to say yes. And, currently we have a president that we have on record, him saying, just keep doing it and they'll eventually say yes. And I have evidence of that. And then I went away to college for a short time, very short time. I got kicked out and my brother was in prison. He got out of prison and things happened. But I have this really vivid memory of I had two best friends. One of them was my roommate, and one of them was a girl who lived in the same apartment complex right off campus as I did. And she was really my best friend, just the boy that I lived with. We had friends from like high school, you know what I mean? So we had a longer friendship. And, I fell in love with her, and we, meaning her and I, never got to find out if we were going to be something different than friends. Because one night I was already DJing at this point and playing in clubs and doing radio and stuff like that while at school. I was a drug dealer at school. And without going through the whole story and taking 20 minutes, there was a night that I just lost. I just lost who I was. And she was sleeping on one of the couches in our living room, and another girl that we were friends with was sleeping on the other couch in our living room. And my roommate and his girlfriend were starting to have sex in our bedroom. So I didn't want to just sit there and listen to him. And I'm really turned on from a bunch of things during the night. Two of them are having sex like 4 feet away from me. I went into my living room not knowing that there was two girls sleeping on the couches. I thought they left. I was really drunk, and I didn't have anywhere to sleep. So I sat in the big chair and couldn't fall asleep. And then I climbed on top of my friend and say, hey, I got nowhere to sleep. And she complained and cursed, get off me, and this and that. And I said, I have nowhere to sleep. I'm sleeping here. And she fell back asleep because she was already asleep. She was drunk too. And I sexually assaulted her. And while I was in the process of doing it, she woke up and she literally threw me off her. Like it wasn't like get off, Michael, and there wasn't a struggle. She literally, like that adrenaline took over. She went from completely asleep and drunk to me landing 4 feet away on the floor. So I went back into the other room, into my bed. By then, my roommate and his girlfriend were done having sex, and I went to bed. And she came in the morning and she woke up the three of us and she said, this is what your friend did to me this morning. She kicked me as hard as she could and stomped on me a bunch of times. And she told them, and we weren't friends any longer. And I loved and adored her. Like beyond wanting to have sex with her and wanting her to be my girlfriend, I loved and adored her. She was such a great person. And when people talk about, well, did she do this? She couldn't have been a better friend. There was never any moment that she ever gave me, hey, I want to have sex with you. There was none of that. We made out once in a club for 5 minutes while she was drunk, and I knew what that was. I still kissed her, but I knew she was just drunken in a club. You know what I mean? She never did anything that at any point you could look at, like say we were in court somewhere and they said, well, did she do this? My defense attorney, there was nothing I could say she ever did wrong except be friends with an unstable boy. She didn't go to the police. She didn't tell the school. She didn't tell anybody else but just the two of them. And everything changed for me because now I had crossed the line. I was now one of them. And different than them, I felt shame. So I went from somebody that was potentially a drug addict, potentially an alcoholic, to full blown. And that was my life for my next decade. Was crime. I was a mobster, low level mobster. I was a criminal, drug dealer, really high volume, DJ'd in major clubs in Manhattan and Philadelphia and throughout Jersey, and just an all around yucky person. Everything that was beautiful about me, about every year, it just dissolved in less and less and less. But it started really with that night. There's things that I did that were quote unquote worse, but none of them were my best friend. And none of them looked at me the next day when I saw her in the courtyard and looked at me with this utter pain of, how did you do this to me? She never said that to me, just in her eyes, just like, how did you do this?
You've taken a lot of accountability for this in recent years. Have you ever taken accountability and made amends directly with the woman you assaulted?
So again, along with other things changed. I haven't gone to meetings in 20 something years, just still sober, 35 years, frickin' miracle and all of that. But I lost my way. Just what AA didn't fit me when I was 12 years sober. But answering your question, when we came to that part of me making amends in the 12 steps, this was 1991, and they didn't know what they know now. 12-step programs didn't know really, because there's this thing that says you make amends wherever possible, except where to do so was going to hurt others. And both my sponsor and his sponsor, because sponsor was sober 40 years and was the only person in New Jersey sober 40 years, both of them said, we don't go back to the girls and women we harmed and just show up in their life and get on their doorsteps because they might be parents with kids and they may have kept this quiet to everybody in their life, and we're just showing up and creating mess. What we know today is, even if that was true, she would have wanted to know that I knew and the impact it had on me and that I was sorry. We know that now. We didn't know that then. But what my sponsor did, which was spectacular, he says, well, I'm going to encourage you not to do that, but I want you to find somewhere to volunteer at a rape crisis center. And I called all over New Jersey. Everywhere said no to me, because who's going to trust some guy to come in and they don't want me in their building. Do you know what I mean? But there was one of them that had gotten a grant, that the grant, if they didn't do something with it, they were going to have to give the money back to do some public speaking around date and acquaintance rape. So me and one of the people who ran the program, we went around to VOTEC schools, high schools, colleges, and even a few corporations. And she would talk about what date and acquaintance rape was. And I would tell my stories. And that's what my amends was. And it was so powerful to me. And it's what eventually got me to be a social worker and counselor. So something magical came out of it. But the particular woman I never made direct amends to. And I've tried to find her because now there's the internet. You could find everybody. I haven't found her. And it's now 40 something years back. And I just can't see how that's a benefit to anybody. But I tried a lot. There was a few steps. So first one was getting clean and sober in 1989. And not long after I got clean and sober, very liberal use of the word, because I didn't do any drugs and alcohol, but I had I'll just say a really tough day in early sobriety. I was 6 weeks clean. And there's a lot of tangles to it, but I decided I was going to kill my girlfriend and then myself. And without me saying a word, somehow she saw that and she found a way to stop it, locked me out of her house, and she called her therapist, who I had met a few times, and said, "What do I do with him?" And so I had slept out on the front step of her house. That's where I slept that night because she wouldn't let me in. And she let me in the morning, and she gave me, after speaking to her therapist, she said, this is what she said. "We already have it set up that you can move into inpatient tomorrow. I mean, you can move into inpatient this morning willingly. If not, the police are going to come here and take you, and you're going to be there against your will." So I said yes under duress. And what I understood at the end of those 6 weeks, there's two positive things that happened from the mental hospital I was in. Two things. One, I never wanted to be in a mental hospital again. So when I came out, I was motivated to do recovery, which
your story starts with growing up in a violent family, then you become a perpetrator of violence yourself, to now being a facilitator of healing. How did you get here? What was the catalyst for such a drastic change?
there was a few steps. So first one was getting clean and sober in 1989. And not long after I got clean and sober, very liberal use of the word, because I didn't do any drugs and alcohol, but I had I'll just say a really tough day in early sobriety. I was 6 weeks clean. And there's a lot of tangles to it, but I decided I was going to kill my girlfriend and then myself. And without me saying a word, somehow she saw that and she found a way to stop it, locked me out of her house, and she called her therapist, who I had met a few times, and said, "What do I do with him?" And so I had slept out on the front step of her house. That's where I slept that night because she wouldn't let me in. And she let me in the morning, and she gave me, after speaking to her therapist, she said, this is what she said. "We already have it set up that you can move into inpatient tomorrow. I mean, you can move into inpatient this morning willingly. If not, the police are going to come here and take you, and you're going to be there against your will." So I said yes under duress. And what I understood at the end of those 6 weeks, there's two positive things that happened from the mental hospital I was in. Two things. One, I never wanted to be in a mental hospital again. So when I came out, I was motivated to do recovery, which didn't happen before. The second was, she was my psychologist in there, who became the therapist for the next few years of my life, Lorraine. And so first step was getting clean and sober. Second step was getting really involved in AA, an outpatient program, and with my therapist. Next step was meditation. For whatever reason, I understood early on in AA, even though they all talk about meditation, nobody did meditation back then. They all said meditate all the time, but what they just did was reflect on things, which is a form of meditation, but there was no breathing. There was none of the things that we call meditation today. For whatever reason, I just knew I needed to learn how to meditate. So I searched all over the tri-state area for books for meditation. I found two. Can you imagine Borders and Barnes and Noble not having books on meditation based on where we are in 2025? And again, I lived in the New York, New Jersey area. It's not like I lived in some farm in Wyoming. You know what I mean? So I got a couple books. I did what I thought they told me to do. So I did that. Um, Reiki entered my life a few years later, somewhere in all of this. Oh, yeah, right. I didn't answer your question. So between recovery and meditation, I decided I want to go to school to become a social worker. And that's where that started. I went to school and I was only one semester into, I was in my first semester of studying social work. This was now my fourth college I'd gone to because I failed out of three of them. I got hired somewhere part-time. And it was working with kids and families in crisis, like I said, and I eventually became the director. And I was doing in-home family preservation, which now that I'm much older, I realize how scary that was, but because of what I had just been through, it didn't seem scary to me at all, you know? So it started there, Sierra. That's where it started. Yeah, and one of the things that the self-help community has completely hijacked and taken out of context is you can't love anybody till you love yourself. But if you've never experienced being loved, you don't know how to love yourself. You need to experience love to be able to love yourself. My Reiki master and former spiritual teacher, Betsy, and we're still in contact, but she used to say all the time whenever we'd get to another level of work, she'd always say, after we were done with that chunk, she would say, Michael, put this in a reference because sometime down the road, you're going to need this reference of this experience when things get scary and you're challenged. And she would keep giving me new references that were further along in the path so that I had something to relate back to. Oh, I can do that. Oh, I've experienced that. And specifically, I'm thinking of when I was backpacking in the Gobi Desert by myself in the desert, is I had experiences that said to me, I am going to be taken care of somehow, some way. I'm going to be taken care of. Part of what made me an activist is because I'm a man, because I have light skin, because I'm decent looking, and because of just the way I present myself, I get to stand in places and not get shot as a protester and an activist. I get to do that. I get to go into neighborhoods and try to create some bridges. I don't do as much of that these days. I mean, I'm getting older, but um, but I get to had the opportunity to do those things because I've already experienced the violence and it sort of doesn't scare me the way it scares normal people. So I get to show up for stuff because I have that threshold of experience. I mean, I've been shot at. I've had a gun put to my head. I've been stabbed. I had somebody attack me with a baseball bat. And every one of those things, I deserved it. I can say that. They were people I robbed that were other criminals and mobsters and drug dealers, but I've had all of that. So what I make of it is there's some part of me, I call it my higher self, but there's some part of me that all along understood that I had something to do here. And no matter what the thing was, in spite of me, I kept getting pointed there. Some things that I've reflected on over the years is I should have been in prison. I should have had legal consequences. And I should have been hated by a lot of people. And there was periods of this recovery process I've been in where I almost felt like I still deserve that. And then what changed for me was I saw the work that I was doing now, not now as in 2025, now as in, we'll say, 2010 or 2012, that the work I was doing now at that time in my life, I wouldn't be doing that work if I was in prison. That the dozens or hundreds of people that I've affected directly, forget about the ripples and the advocacy work, directly, they wouldn't have had that. I don't need to carry this shame anymore. When we talk about shame and guilt and remorse and those kind of things, from what I understand, both in my training, my personal and professional life, is the reason we have this thing is it pokes us enough to do something different or better. It's not meant to be something we just carry with us, you know? Just like loss, if somebody dies or moves away or breaks up with you, we're not supposed to be in mourning and grief for the rest of our life. We're supposed to still have that little thing that hurts every time I think of them, but we're not supposed to live every day with grief. We're not supposed to live with shame. They're supposed to facilitate something. And it facilitated something in me, and nobody gained from me carrying shame. And I have always held, Sierra, that if any point anybody from my past I hurt found out I was still alive and they found my name through the internet and wanted to press charges against me, I would show up in court and say, this is what I did. I've never had it. Well, the first few years in recovery, I didn't have that because I still had criminal mind. You know what I mean? Still wanted to get away with it. But when that was different for me, I've always had, and specifically that best friend in school, if she ever showed up and said, I want you to pay for what you did to my life, I would have been like, let's go to the police department right now so I could turn myself in. I've always had that. And in writing this memoir, the people in my life are like, oh my God, Michael, you're putting this in a book. You realize the consequences. And I said, I realize the potential consequences. And some man that's not a famous person that just got caught from something they did from their past, some man has to come forward and say, I did this. This is what it was like for me. This is what happened to them. And this is one example of what that recovery and change can be like. You don't have to take the same path I did because I don't give it as a prescription. Just this took me decades to become a good human being. Not weeks, not months, not years. It took decades. And when Jane, the editor, who's a dear friend, and she used to be a women's studies professor, instructor, and now she's an author and editor, and she predominantly works with feminist stuff. But when we were talking about some, I consulted with some legal people and stuff like that, and I have some friends who work for magazines, and they're always needing to do this. I said, do we want to turn this into a novel? Make it of some town in Iowa somewhere, or Ohio, or Pittsburgh, or wherever. Do we want to make this into a novel? Because part of it seems not believable, even to me, and it's my life. So, and she said to me very clearly, with no hesitation, Michael, the power of your story is that you're coming forward, and there's not a reason you have to, except you think your story is important and valuable. And that's what makes it. The vulnerability, the risk that you're taking is what is the impact. Because certainly I am not the only person, male or otherwise, that's done really awful stuff and turned their life around. There's nothing unique about that. I'm not dismissing how invaluable it's been, but there's been thousands, if not millions, of people who have done awful things and became decent people. There's nothing spectacular about that. The fact that I'm choosing to have this conversation with you recorded and you're going to release it, that's what's different. I'm not in trouble. My life is spectacular. And I'm risking that knowing there could be consequences. Being hated and being put in prison or being in economic debt, those aren't the only ways that we pay consequences. If anybody recorded my life in my 20s and made a documentary out of it, I would have been better off in prison. I would have had a better life in prison And I mean that. My life was awful. It was all my own doing, but it was awful. I hated every minute of every hour of every day. My life was awful, ripped me to shreds. Are you familiar with Brianna Wiest? I can't think of the name of her book, and it's really popular. It's a self-help pop psychology book, and it's a great book. But her quote that's famous is, "Trauma is not our fault, but healing is our responsibility." It is. At some point, I had to become a better person than I was. I never thought I'd be a wonderful person, and I think I'm a pretty wonderful person today. Do I know people that are better than me? I am surrounded by really extraordinary people, and I mean that. You know how everybody loves their friends? I love my friends, and the things that they're doing in the world and in the community are mind-blowing. Like any one of them could have been my hero. The fact that I'm surrounded by them, I've worked really hard. I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me. I mean, obviously, I want people to have compassion, empathy, what I went through, but I don't want anybody pity on me of where my life went. I made the choices I made. I made those choices. And then eventually I made some other choices.
What do you want listeners to take away from this conversation?
Really simple. None of this was your fault. Your father was like this before you were born. Your mother was like this before you were born. Your brother was like this before you were born. My mother didn't get worse, but the men in my family, they all got worse. And then they got worse. And then they got worse. Like when I was 8 and 10 and 12, I wanted to fix all of them and everything that was happening. And I was like, how can I be a better kid so that they stop doing what they're doing? I just wish I or somebody else would have just looked in my eyes and held my hands and said, none of this is your fault. I'm assuming I know what would have been different. I assume what would have happened is I would have stopped being my family's caretaker when I wasn't even in middle school yet, And generally, when we're talking about that story, we're talking about people who weren't upper middle class, because that's what I was at that point in my life. We're not talking generally about white people. We're not generally talking about people that are of great intelligence. When we're talking about people that are in messes that they're trying to clean up and take care of from their family, there's generally other people attached to that story. But that is my experience. We talk about this a lot now, and a big part of pop culture is somebody has to break the cycle. I broke the cycle. Now there's other people in my family that have also broke the cycle and turned out differently than what my parents and grandparents and great grandparents. There's lots of people that are alive in my family, cousins, nieces, nephews, that are good people today. Do you know what I mean? They're good people. They also broke the cycle. They didn't have to go as low as I did, but they broke the cycle. And but I was the beginning of it. For young men, that if you're worrying about if you're starting to get near that line of crossing that line of being somebody you don't want to be, but you can't really stop yourself or don't know how, the words that I would like to share with you is, it takes 10 minutes to have decades of work to clean up. 10 minutes. Right, but I'm just saying, even if you do, and you quote unquote get away with it, you don't get away with it. And you become somebody really ugly that you swore you were never going to be. And if you've crossed that line, you can change too. You're not worse than I was. For women, it's the other end of that story. I think it's important for women to know that men can change, because there's a lot of, out of lack of better words, support of kind of being a jerk today. A lot of support for it. Like, you're almost patted on your back for being a jerk right now. And one, men can change. And when I say that, I don't mean that your boyfriend, your partner, or your husband, who's similar to I was, is going to go into therapy and 3 months from now, he's going to be a great person. It may take at bare minimum years, if not decades. Men can change, but don't wait around. It's not your job to be the good wife or the good partner that just sticks with him till he works it out. If it's really clear he's not inspired and motivated to do something, regardless of whether you're with him or not, it's not your job to take care of him. This isn't 1942. Like, I always say their names wrong because there was a politician in New Jersey by similar. Is it the Menendez boys or the Melendez, the two brothers? The Menendez. They've changed, but it took decades. Like the years are almost parallel of when we were creating messes and doing awful things and when we changed. I only know this because somebody that's part of my promotional team made me watch the Netflix thing and said, Michael, you and them are running in parallel. So anyway, that's my thing, is we really can change. You're never too far down the road where you can't be something more than you are now. And I know it's really hip to say, well, narcissists can't change. Well, here, if I was 20 years old in 2025, everybody I know would tell me I'm a narcissist, if not worse. And I want to just shift our roles here for 30 seconds. Thank you for being willing to have these conversations. And there's some of the conversations that I've had for podcasts and radio shows that they decided they weren't okay to share it. So it never got posted because on some level, you could be accused of condoning, well, he did these awful things and he didn't go to jail and all of that. And he wasn't in prison. He didn't pay a price. And I really appreciate that you have the courage to see the bigger picture, to say, well, if they're willing to take the risk, I'm willing to hold their hand and do it with them. It's what we're here for, you and I. We're completely different people, but that's what we're here for.
Tell us about your memoir.
So my book's Raised by Wolves, Possibly Monsters, From Mobster to Reiki Master. And you can really find it in any online bookseller. It's in the big ones, and that word that people aren't saying very often these days because he makes a bit too much money for anybody. But you can find it there, but you can also find it at all of the other places, Barnes & Noble and Kobo and everywhere. And you can actually find it on my website. So my website is michaelswerdloff.com. You can actually buy it directly right from where it gets printed from my website and take out all of the middle humans and all of the multi-billionaire companies, you know. But it is currently the Kindle ebook version is currently on sale at Amazon for 99 cents. I really want people to have the opportunity to read it. And I just really want to share with everybody, but particularly women, particularly young women. The first quarter of the book is a really intense, uncomfortable read. Please take care of yourself while doing so. This isn't a vision quest where you have to fight your way through this book because it's a powerful, impactful book. Put it down for days or weeks if you need to and take care of yourself. Nobody has to fight their way through whatever this facilitates inside of you. Thanks for having me, and I really appreciate you.
Thank you for tuning in to From the Heart Side Out, hosted by See the Sex Lady, produced by Christine Johnson of Pure Pod Vibes, and music by Rico the Artist. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform of choice. And don't forget to share with a friend so they can learn something too. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Please send any comments or questions to podcast@seethesexlady.com. That's podcast@CEEthesexlady.com. Until next time, keep loving, living, and leading from the heart side out.